Hello. There goes a motorbike outside my study window. Hello, welcome. It's 5 o'clock. It's nearly 5 o'clock. That is to say, it's just after 5 o'clock. And it's time for another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. A bit late today and a bit flustered because I've just been, being a parent, trying to mediate an argument between two of my children over their den. Whose den is it? Who has the rights to the resources? All the sticks seem to belong to one child, the older one, funnily enough, and the younger one feels like he's not getting a look in, and all that kind of thing. You know, I'm sure I well remember it with my brother. My brother's a lot younger than me, 6 years younger than me. So actually, when I was a kid, when I was 11, he was 5, and so there wasn't a huge amount of conflict between us. But of course, if you're a bit closer in age to your siblings, there might be more conflict, and around here at the moment sometimes there is. So yes, I'm feeling slightly harassed, but never mind, I'm sure it's all going to be fine. And yeah, I mean, what can you say, hey? Right, okay, so we're on to chapter 9. Where are we? No, not that one. Yes, so Jo's been to the baths with Lucy's brothers and her father, which has been quite a strange experience for him, although actually it's not so very far from going to a sauna in Scandinavia today. They still do the sort of heat room thing, you know, steam room, and the twigs, the sapling or the willow twigs. I think they use willow, I can't remember off the top of my head, and of course Jo doesn't know, so I don't actually name them here. They're thin and supple and not scratchy. Anyway, and then if it had been snowing, they would have gone out. When they came out of the bathhouse, they would have then rolled in the snow. So yeah, not sure I'd really fancy that myself, but there we are. Okay, so chapter 9. Yes, and on the way out, he's just set eyes on Thorbjorn, who's also set eyes on him and is giving him the evils, basically. And Jo is worried about this. Chapter 9. Lucy wasn't at home when they let themselves into the house, nor were Aileen, Sorka or Anya. Seeing Jo looking around for them, Peder said, "They've gone to the women's baths." He drew up a stool beside the wool baskets, fetched a teasel, and began to comb the fleece that Jo and Lucy had picked over. Matthias lit both reed lamps and went to the loom to continue the weaving that Anya had been working on. Lockie poured beer into the cups, which were still on the table. "Have a drink, Jo," he said, holding one out to him. "It's a good idea after the baths." Jo took a cup and pulled up a stool opposite Peder. "Do you work all day every day?" he asked. "No," Peder said. "There's a bit of time most days to play outside, or else we do something together when the important jobs are done." "But not now?" "Now? I don't know about you, but I'm not really in the mood for playing football or anything like that." "No, I suppose not." Jo took a bundle of fleece from the basket and began picking it over, glad that there was something he knew how to do. Lockie built up the fire and then disappeared out of the back door to the yard. "So if you're indoors, do you do something useful?" Jo asked. "Not always, but you may as well when half the family's out." Peder shrugged. "Clapping and singing games don't work very well when there are only 2 of you. Dice is better with more people too. We could play Nerfataffel, I suppose, but that would be better outside, where you can see the board and the pieces properly. I'd say it's a bit cold for that." Jo thought about this. At home, if he was indoors, he would read a book or watch television, or he might play with his Technic Lego or do something on the computer. But they didn't have any of those things to do here. They didn't even have paper and pencils for drawing. For some time the 3 boys worked in silence. Jo guessed that Lucy's brothers probably felt the same sense of calm that he'd felt as they left the baths. He, on the other hand, was still worrying about Thorbjorn and whether Thorbjorn would set out to hurt him deliberately. He wished Lucy would come back. Presently they heard voices outside the house. Lucy pushed open the door, followed by her mother and sisters. "Guess what?" she cried. Jo blinked, startled by how loud her voice sounded in the quietness of the room. "There's a storyteller arrived in Jorvik." Lucy danced around the table. "We saw Inga at the baths. She's invited us over this evening to hear him." Matthias stopped weaving. "That's great." "Fantastic." Peder jumped to his feet. Jo looked at Sorka and Anya. Their faces were also bright with delight. It was clearly an important event. He smiled and nodded, trying to pretend he shared their excitement. "What's all this?" Loki asked, coming in from the yard. "A storyteller at Inga's this evening." "Marvellous. We've got a jar of mead we can take. It's about time there was another gathering. There's been nothing since the horse fighting 2 moons ago." "Horses? Fighting?" Jo muttered to Peder. Lucy's brother nodded. "Not our horse. Or other working horses. They're specially bred stallions. They often fight to the death. It's really exciting." "Is it?" Jo couldn't keep the doubt out of his voice. The idea of such gentle animals being made to fight was somehow rather nasty. "Well, I prefer storytelling, Lucy said, pulling up a stool beside Jo. "They tell such amazing tales of battles and voyages." "Tall tales, more like," Matthias said from the loom. "I've never heard a story of a voyage that didn't include a sea monster, but we didn't see a single one in all the time I was away. In all the time we were away." "Maybe you just weren't in the right place," Lucy said. "Maybe. Perhaps they'd gone south to warmer waters." Matthias laughed. The mood in the house was jolly for the rest of the afternoon. Each member of the family took it in turns to come and sit on a low stool at Aileen's feet while she combed carefully through their hair. "Is she looking for something?" Jo whispered to Lucy. "Yes, of course. Nits, ticks, fleas?" "Oh, no." "Well, at least if you look, you can get rid of them. We take care of ourselves. Here, unlike the southerners, they're hopping with life, and they hardly ever wash. It's disgusting." She shuddered. When Aileen had finished, Loki took her place and combed through her hair, keeping up a patter of conversation, gossip and jokes all the while. In the meantime, everyone else worked at the task they had chosen, joining in with the banter or keeping quiet as they wished. Jo was surprised to feel real satisfaction at being part of all this. He wondered idly how Sam would cope. Not very well, he thought, especially with being parted from his phone. They ate supper early, the same stew and bread as at lunchtime, and then began to get ready to go out. Jo watched from the fireside as Aileen lifted some planks which lay across the floor at the far end of the room. Beneath was a deep rectangular hole, almost completely filled by a chest. She lifted the lid and brought out for each person a set of clothes made from more brightly coloured fabric than their day-to-day clothes. From a box inside the chest came a selection of ornamental brooches, belts and clothespins, and then a tiny pot with a lid and a thin piece of bone with a blunt end. She opened the pot, dipped the bone into it, and then drew dark lines carefully around her eyes. Then she turned to Sorka, Loki and Matthias and did the same. Jo watched, fascinated. He'd never seen men wearing eyeliner before. While everyone else was changing their clothes, Aileen came over to him. "Do you have anything else to wear, Jo?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Would you like to borrow something? I have some clothes which are too small for Peder now." "Are you sure? What if I spill something? I wouldn't want to spoil them." Aileen smiled wistfully. "It doesn't matter if you do. I don't have another little boy who will wear them." Jo frowned. In her other life at Fishbourne, Lucy had had a younger brother who had died. Perhaps the same child was missing from this family. He hadn't thought to ask Lucy about it. He took the clothes and put them on. They weren't very different in style to the clothes he'd taken off, but the fabric was finer and the colours more vivid. He felt a good deal smarter in them. "Are we ready?" Lockie asked at last. "Each of you youngsters please bring a stool or a sheepskin to sit on. I have the mead and the drinking horn. Your mother has the food." He looked round at them all. "What a fine family," he beamed. "Come on then, let's go." Joe was the last person out of the house. "Should I lock the door or something?" he asked. "No." Aileen swung the cord which hung down from her belt, like the one Lucy had to carry her knife. A pair of heavy iron keys clinked. "The few valuable things we have are locked away. Just make sure it's shut so the dogs don't wander off." Joe gave the door an extra tug just to be sure, and then followed the rest of the family through the cold, dark streets. The sky had cleared, and as he walked, he looked up at the moon and stars above. It was strange to think that it was the same moon, the same stars that would shine on him at home 1,000 years from now. Suddenly, in the middle of all the excitement, he felt a surge of homesickness. If only he could go back, just for half an hour, or for tea maybe, and then come back here and carry on. He felt like he hadn't seen Dad in ages, though it was only this morning, even in Lucy's time, and he hadn't seen Mum in a week. But, of course, it wasn't possible. He swallowed and clenched his teeth until the pricking behind his eyes and nose had stopped. The house they came to looked exactly the same to Joe as Lucy's house, long and narrow, with a workshop at the front. "Inga's husband is a silversmith," Lucy said in Joe's ear. "Look how much nicer their place is." Joe looked, but couldn't see what she meant. "In what way?" "That stuff plastered over the outside of the walls makes it warmer." "It makes it smellier too. What is it?" "Animal dung. But it only smells because it was done recently. Soon you won't notice it. And there are windows in it too." "Windows?" He peered through the darkness. "Do you mean that there?" He pointed to a tiny square above the door, whose texture was different to the rest of the walls. "That's right." Lucy was full of awe. "You're probably thinking it must let the cold in, but it's covered over with pig's bladder, so there's no draught." Joe pressed his lips together to keep himself from laughing. "Does it let in any light, or is it just for show?" Lucy didn't notice his sarcasm. "Of course it lets light in, and they have them in every wall." "Goodness." Joe did his best to sound impressed, since that was clearly what Lucy expected. "It's a pity we're here after nightfall. You should see what it's like in the day." They followed the rest of the family inside. Behind the workshop was a single large room, just as in Lucy's house. The same kind of reed lamps had been mounted on the walls as in the bathhouse, but they guttered and smoked, so it was still far from bright. It was also incredibly hot and crowded. Come in," roared a bear of a man with fiery red hair and beard. "The more the merrier. We'll find space for everyone somewhere." They edged into the room, climbing round and over people already seated on stools or on the floor. The air buzzed with chatter. Lucy found a space and spread her sheepskin down on the ground, and then her cloak on top of it. Joe laid his cloak down on top of hers and squeezed in beside her, passing back the stool he'd brought for Aileen to use. More and more people arrived, until he guessed there were probably 100 or more crammed in shoulder to shoulder, some almost on top of each other. When the last remaining inch of space had been filled, a man who had been standing at the front picked his way across to a tall stool. It's just as well I'm not recording this for Audible. A man who had been standing at the front picked his way across to a tall stool beside the fire. Immediately the room was quiet. He sat down and began to speak, his voice rising and falling in a sing-song rhythm. Joe listened, bewildered. The story was in rhyme and peopled with characters that everyone else seemed to know. An old man sitting on the edge of the room even appeared to know the words, because his lips moved in time with the storyteller's. The language was much more flowery than Joe was used to, and it took him some time to realise that wound dew meant blood, and the whale's road was the sea. Gradually, however, he picked up the gist of the tale about giants and goblins and gods, and by the end he was gripped. When the story had finished, there was a brief pause while some of the listeners shuffled round. And then the second story began, of a ship crossing the sea to a new country, of storms and fierce winds, and a monster curled around an island, keeping the people who lived there prisoners. At the end of this tale, cups of barley beer were passed round to the children, while the adults passed drinking horns like lockies to one another, lifting them to their lips to drink the mead. Trays of food were handed round, with bread and cheese and dried fruit. Nobody took very much, Joe noticed. He helped himself to some dried apple and sipped his beer. Perhaps he was getting used to it at last, because it didn't taste as bad as when he'd first been given it. By the end of the third story, he was feeling pleasantly sleepy. The younger children had fallen asleep already, their heads on their mother's laps. Joe drew up his knees and rested his chin on his arms. The storyteller had changed tack now, and was narrating a saga for the adults of love and lust, deception, betrayal and revenge. Joe soon found that he'd lost track of who was who. People seemed to keep being killed, rather like the feud that Lucy had told him about. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift, imagining being at home again with Mum and Sam, only Thorbjorn was somehow there too, prancing about, and then drawing his knife the moment Mum looked away. It seemed only a few minutes later that Joe felt himself shaken awake, but Thorbjorn was nowhere to be seen. "Come on, sleepyheads," Matthias said. "It's time to go home." Joe and Lucy stumbled to their feet and pulled their cloaks around them. Matthias picked up the sheepskin, and they let themselves be carried by the tide of people out of the house and onto the moonlit street. "Good night, good night," voices shouted all around them. Joe rubbed his eyes, glad to have been woken from the dream, but still aching to get back to sleep again. Jorvik was a blur, dark and shadowy and freezing cold. "I must tell Lucy about Thorbjorn," he murmured to himself as he trailed along behind Matthias. "I must tell Lucy about Thorbjorn." Back at the house, however, he rolled into bed beside Pedda and was asleep in moments. He was woken early the following morning by frantic whispering. It was still dark in the room. He lay for a while, watching the mist of his breath rise from his mouth, trying to work out what was going on. "They can't be," hissed Aileen. "They definitely are," replied Lockie. "Did you check them last night?" "Of course not. After all that mead, I didn't think of anything except my bed." "So they were like this then?" "Must have been. I assume they were asleep." "They don't look very asleep." "Don't blame me, woman." Lockie's voice rose. "You didn't notice either." Further down the room, Matthias stirred. "What's the matter?" he asked blearily. There was a pause. "It's the dogs," his father answered at last. Joe heard Aileen stifle a sob. "Someone came in while we were out last night. They've been poisoned." So that's the end of chapter 9. The plot thickens. Who was it? We think we know. I think they know too. So that's it for today. Same time tomorrow, just after 5 o'clock. I'll try and be, we'll try and make it 5 o'clock. But yeah, I've only managed once, I think, this week. Although I'm never more than a minute or two late. So it's not that bad after all, really. So yeah, I'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock for chapter 10. Brilliant. Great.